Many of these games were printed under license in the UK by a company called Games Workshop, which was set up by Steve Jackson and even Ian Livingstone. And all these games were heavily featured in the house magazine White Dwarf. Now, if you were playing games in the 80s in the UK, you read White Dwarf. White Dwarf was just the fulcrum that everything moved around. I remember my first issue of White Dwarf was number 57. I read every single word of that thing. Didn't understand it, but it blew my mind. Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone really was, on the cusp of the hobby taking off. And they knew that a lot of people didn't quite have a way in, and they wrote a book called The Warlock of Firetop Mountain, which was a solo adventure game book. I mean, we'd had choose your own adventure books before that, where you read a couple of pages and then make a decision about where the story can go. Warlock of Firetop Mountain was slightly different in that it had a kind of rudimentary game system. You could fight monsters and go on a quest, and that book was a huge success. And it eventually spawned a series of about 60 titles, countless spin-offs and hordes of similar copycat series from other publishers. And they sold in their millions. So Fighting Fantasy Gamebooks, they scored over traditional role-playing games in a few different regards. As I say, it was a really simple game system. I think in the 80s, games tended to get more and more complicated. I mean, I think they started off complex in the 1970s, and they just got more and more complex as time went on. A lot of games sold themselves on being more realistic than D&D. But the Fighting Fantasy books, by contrast, they had a game system that was described in just a couple of pages. You just read those couple of pages telling you how to fight a monster, and then you were away. You were straight into the adventure. And being single player as well, oftentimes a barrier to RPGs is that you need to have a group of 4 to 6 people together at the same time to play. For my own games, it was very difficult to get people together, even then when we had tons of time, when we were just school kids. So now, obviously, all grown up, it's even harder. But if you wanted just a hit of that sort of fantasy adventure, these games were absolutely ideal. And they were portable. You can play them on the bus. You can't play AD&D on the bus. Not easily. And they were quick to produce. I think a lot of full role-playing games, obviously it takes a lot of time to write that stuff and do play testing. Once the FF system was in place, they could just hire an artist and a writer, get them. And I think at the commercial peak, they were publishing like 6 a year. And they were cheap. They were cheap to the consumer. In 85, consulting my copious notes, D&D Basics, that was £9.50, which is about £28 today. And to play AD&D, you needed the Player's Handbook, the Monster Manual, and the Dungeon Master's Guide. And they were all at a tenner, which was £30. So, like in today's money, that's about 90. Actually, if you, it's the same now. If you buy the new edition, you spend about 90 quid on them. By contrast, Fighting Fantasy book, it's like £1.25 or £1.50 or something like that. The artwork in Fighting Fantasy books was incredible. Obviously, Jackson and Livingstone, they had access to all these artists who'd worked for Games Workshop, and they knew what kids liked. Puffin Books had, they'd wanted more sort of child-friendly, kind of cutesy artwork, but these guys, they knew what people were interested in. It was kind of just on the cusp of being a bit too scary. It was very detailed. It was very, very atmospheric. You had artists like Russ Nicholson on the first 2 books. Later on, you had the likes of Ian McCaig. A lot of very, very exciting atmospheric illustrations were produced for those books, and that was a huge part of their appeal. And I think being produced in the UK and largely by English and British writers and artists, they really highlighted the difference between American and British fantasy. The stuff in the UK was sort of grungier, it was nastier. I think if you compare the first edition AD&D books to the Fighting Fantasy books, there's no competition. You know, those early D&D books, there's an amateurish charm, but it is amateurish, whereas the Fighting Fantasy books look so much better. And later on, when TSR started using these kind of more professional, you know, artists, let's say, working at a higher level, you know, you had artists like Larry Elmore and Jeff Easley, who were brilliant. I've got a lot of love for all that stuff. Keith Parkinson. But there's still a difference. The American fantasy, it looks very clean. It almost looks like a Renaissance fair. You know, everyone's got fantastic hair. You know, there's a kind of beautifulness to it. Whereas in the British stuff, you get that grungy, sort of nasty stuff. You have more of a sense of humour as well, the more sort of scatological. You know, I remember that lots of jokes about goblin shit in there. John Blanche was always one of my favourite artists, and he illustrated the Sorcery series, which was a kind of subset of Fighting Fantasy books. And there was a sort of twisted quality to his work. There was a humorous side to his work. There was a dirty side to it. Really atmospheric. There was a sort of punky aesthetic. When you get later on, when Games Workshop produced the Warhammer fantasy role-playing game, that cover's got a dwarf with a mohawk, and you never see anything like that in anything by TSR. You know, and obviously, you know, these days, you know, your bank manager's got a mohawk, but back then, back in the 80s, that looked weird and that looked interesting. You know, people with tattoos on their faces, and people are used to seeing that stuff now, but back then it really gave itself a quality. And I think to this day, the British fantasy stuff, it's got a weird sort of slightly surreal quality. It's got that nastier side. It's just really fantasy. I think it's really interesting, the kind of contrast between the two.